picture this for a second. It's yesterday afternoon, Sunday, February 22nd, 2026. You're in Puerto Vallarta,
Right.
and it's one of those absolutely perfect golden afternoons that you see on the postcards. Maybe you're sitting by a hotel pool with a book, or you're walking down the Malecon looking forward to a sunset dinner.
I mean, it's the definition of paradise. It's the exact image the tourism board sells.
Exactly. And for decades, that's been the reality for most visitors. But yesterday, that image was violently overlaid with something else entirely. We're talking about plumes of thick black smoke rising over the coastline, literally blocking out that sun.
Yeah.
The sound of sirens replacing the mariachi bands, and this eerie, terrifying silence falling over streets that are usually just packed with life.
It was a wildly jarring shift. In security circles, we call this a code red security collapse. It effectively turned a bustling international resort city into a ghost town in a matter of hours.
And the reason for this sudden shift? Well, it's arguably the biggest news story in Mexico and, honestly, perhaps the entire hemisphere right now. Yesterday, the Mexican military, acting on intelligence shared by the U.S., launched a massive raid, and it resulted in the death of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes.
Better known to the world, and certainly to international law enforcement, as El Mencho.
Right, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, the man with a $15 million bounty on his head, the king of cocaine, he is dead.
He is. And look, while the headlines today are celebrating the removal of a high-value target, which is, the sterile term governments like to use, if you look at the stack of sources we have for today's deep dive, the story isn't really about the victory of the raid.
No, it's not about the medal ceremony at all.
Exactly. It's about the costs. It's about the vacuum. We've been looking at ground-level reports from Reddit, live flight data, State Department alerts, and some heavy geopolitical analysis, and they all point to one single thing, which is massive uncertainty.
And that's exactly what we're digging into today. We aren't just looking at the military operation, though the details there are pretty wild. We're unpacking why the city of Puerto Vallarta paralyzed so quickly. We need to talk about the economics of the cartel and this terrifying concept popping up in our research called the Acapulco scenario.
Right. And we really have to ask the uncomfortable question. What happens when you remove a monolithic leader from the board? Does it stop the violence, or does it actually uncork a bottle of chaos that you just can't put back?
So let's get right into it. We have the official statements, we have the panic on social media, we have the hard data. Let's start with the event itself. What actually went down yesterday morning?
It started early Sunday. The operation took place in Tapalpa, Jalisco. Now, for listeners who might not know the geography there, this is up in the Sierra Madre Mountains.
Okay.
It's not on the beach. It's rugged, very difficult terrain, and it has been the absolute heart of the cartel's territory for a very long time.
And the target, El Mencho, he was 59 years old. And he isn't your typical gangster, right? He's not just some guy who got lucky on the streets.
No, not at all. And this is crucial to understanding the CJNG as an organization. Mencho is a former police officer. He actually served on the force.
Wow.
Yeah. He essentially militarized the drug trade in a way we really hadn't seen before. He brought discipline, he brought heavy weaponry, and he brought a highly strategic mind that allowed him to expand his territory aggressively.
Speaking of that weaponry, the sources we reviewed on the raid mentioned that this wasn't just, a knock on the door with an arrest warrant.
No, this was a war zone.
Yeah.
The military actually seized rocket launchers, specifically RPG-7s.
Okay, hold on. RPG-7s, like military-grade anti-tank weapons.
Yes, exactly. These are shoulder-fired weapons capable of taking down helicopters. In fact, the CJNG has taken down Mexican military helicopters in the past with exactly this kind of hardware.
That's insane.
It gives you an idea of the level of resistance the military faced yesterday. The official report confirms that 4 cartel members were killed at the scene, 2 were arrested, and 3 soldiers were wounded. El Mencho himself was severely wounded in the firefight and actually died while being transported to Mexico City.
So the king is dead. And usually you'd expect the government to take a victory lap, right? Maybe hold a huge press conference, show some photos of the seized drugs and weapons. But what happened next out on the streets was, well, it was immediate.
It was instantaneous. This is that code red response I mentioned earlier. The cartel didn't retreat to the mountains to lick their wounds. They lashed out. We saw a tactic known as narcoblockades, or narcoblockades.
Yeah, I saw the numbers in the report. 252 blockades reported across the country. That sounds like an absolute logistical nightmare to coordinate on the fly.
It is, and honestly, that's the whole point. It showcases their massive reach and their communication network. 65 of those blockades were in the state of Jalisco alone. This is a highly coordinated strategy.
How does it actually work?
Well, cartel members will hijack large vehicles, city buses, semi-trucks, sometimes just private cars. They park them horizontally across major intersections or highways, and then they set them on fire.
It's terrifyingly effective. I mean, it stops the military from moving reinforcements, sure, but it feels like it accomplishes something else too.
It's pure psychological warfare. It sends a massive, undeniable signal to both the population and the government. They're basically saying, we are still here, we control these streets, and we can shut your entire society down whenever we want. It literally turns the infrastructure of the city against the city itself.
And this is exactly where Puerto Vallarta comes into the picture. Usually these resort zones are bubbles, right? I mean, you go there, you stay at the all-inclusive, you don't really see the drug war.
Right.
You might see the National Guard patrolling the beach, but it feels performative, almost like a photo op.
Usually, yes, they're completely insulated. The cartels know that dead tourists are terrible for business. But yesterday, that bubble didn't just leak, it popped.
The descriptions from the sources on the ground are just wild. You have tourists literally running for cover at the Guadalajara airport. But in Puerto Vallarta, it was this sudden, sweeping paralysis. It wasn't just active violence everywhere. It was the threat of violence stopping everything in its tracks.
The transportation network just vanished. Poof. And think about what that means for a tourist on vacation. Taxis stopped running. Ride shares like Uber suspended service immediately because drivers were terrified their cars would be hijacked and burned at a blockade.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The municipal buses just parked. If you were a tourist at a hotel, you were stuck. You literally could not leave the property.
And then the U.S. Embassy steps in.
Right. They issued a shelter-in-place order, which is highly significant. They explicitly told Americans to stay in their hotels, don't go out to dinner, don't walk down to the pharmacy, shops closed up, gas stations shut down completely.
And the airport in PV.
Well, technically it remained open under heavy National Guard protection. But if you look at the flight data we pulled, it was absolute chaos. Delta, Southwest, Alaska, Air Canada, they all just started canceling or diverting flights midair.
There's this one detail from a Reddit thread we found that really stuck with me. It paints such a vivid picture of the confusion. A user described the fractured reality of the situation on the ground.
Oh yeah, the bathtub comment?
Yes. They said some people were down at the resort pool drinking tequilas, completely unaware anything was wrong, while others were upstairs in their rooms, literally filling bathtubs with water because they were terrified the city's utilities would be cut off during a siege.
That is such a very human reaction to an information vacuum.
Yeah.
You have all these wild rumors flying around on WhatsApp, total official silence from the hotel management, and then the undeniable sight of black smoke rising over the city skyline. It creates instant panic.
And filling the bathtub.
That's a primal survival instinct kicking in. People were preparing for a long siege, like a Category 5 hurricane was making landfall, but the hurricane was entirely man-made.
So here's the big question I have after reading through all this. Puerto Vallarta has been relatively safe for a long time. It's a massive family destination. Why was it safe before, and why did it crumble the very second El Mencho was taken out?
This brings us to a concept that is absolutely crucial to understand if you want to get how these organizations truly work. It's a term called the Pax Mafiosa, or the Peace of the Mafia.
Which, I have to say, sounds like a total contradiction in terms. We usually think of the mafia or cartels as inherently violent.
It does sound contradictory, but you have to think about the underlying business logic. El Mencho ran the CJNG with incredibly strict centralized control. He was, by all accounts, a monolith. And like any good, ruthless CEO, he understood that indiscriminate violence is ultimately bad for business.
Right. If you're laundering millions of dollars through local hotels and restaurants, you need tourists to actually be there spending those dollars. You can't launder money if the resort is completely empty.
Exactly. Puerto Vallarta isn't just a drug distribution point. It's a massive, sophisticated hub for money laundering and local extortion. If you start shooting up the boardwalk, the tourists leave, the foreign dollars dry up, and the golden goose is dead.
Okay.
So under Mencho's rule, there was this enforced stability. He prevented internal turf wars because he was the undisputed boss. Nobody dared to fight for the plaza.
The plaza. We see that specific term popping up all over the source documents. Can you define what that means in this context?
Sure. In cartel terminology, the plaza isn't a town square with a fountain. It's a designated territory or a lucrative trafficking corridor. If you control the plaza, you control absolutely everything that moves through it. The drugs, the people, the money, the local cops. When Mencho owned the PV Plaza completely.
So paradoxically, the bad guy was the one actually providing the safety for the tourists.
In a purely functional sense, yes. The Mexican government wasn't the primary guarantor of peace in PV. The cartel monopoly was.
And now that monopoly is completely broken.
That's the major fear right now. The source material talks heavily about the fear of the vacuum. When you decapitate a monolithic criminal organization, it doesn't just quietly stop working. It fractures.
Because the boss isn't there to keep everyone in line.
Right. You have all these lower-ranking members, described in some of the geopolitical briefings as hotheads, who might not have the strategic foresight that Mencho had.
They might not care about the long-term tourism economy at all. They just want to show their muscle right now.
Or they're fighting each other to see who gets to be the new boss. You have ambitious local lieutenants who might think, hey, the old man is gone, now's my time to take the plaza. And that violent internal war is exactly what spills out into the tourist streets.
And that leads us directly to the darkest part of our deep dive today. There's a term popping up in the online discussions and the analysis that honestly sent a chill down my spine. The Acapulco scenario.
Yeah. It's a terrifying comparison for anyone who knows the history of Mexican tourism.
For our listeners who might be a bit younger or just might not know, Acapulco used to be the absolute spot.
It really was. In the 70s and 80s, Acapulco was the crown jewel of the Pacific. It was featured in The Love Boat. It was where Hollywood royalty went to play, Frank Sinatra, Elvis.
That's the same, you think?
Exactly. They all went to Acapulco. It was the Puerto Vallarta of its day.
And now?
Now, it is frequently listed as one of the most violent cities in the entire world. The local economy was completely wrecked by chronic cartel infighting. The plaza there became contested. It went from a global paradise to what some intelligence sources literally describe as a war zone. The luxury hotels closed, the businesses fled, and the international flights just stopped coming.
And the fear is that Puerto Vallarta is currently standing on that exact same precipice.
That's the anxiety keeping locals and informed tourists up at night right now. The Reddit threads we analyzed had this fascinating, albeit grim, debate between two potential outcomes for PV. They called them Scenario Minimus and Scenario Maximus.
I thought that was a great breakdown. It really helps categorize the level of risk we're looking at. Let's explain those for everyone listening.
So Scenario Minimus is essentially the best-case version of this fallout. The theory is that the violence we saw yesterday, the fires, the blockades, the canceled flights, was just a temporary tantrum, a show of force, a violent message of mourning and vengeance for Mencho's death.
Sort of like a message saying, we are furious, we're burning some buses to remind you we still exist, but tomorrow we go back to making money.
Right, exactly. A one-day event, maybe 48 hours of lockdown tops. Then a new leader steps in quietly, the Pax Mafiosa holds, the hierarchy remains intact, and the tourists cautiously come back to the beaches.
Okay, and Scenario Maximus.
That is the full Acapulco scenario. The leadership structure collapses entirely. Rival cartels, maybe folks from Sinaloa who have been eyeing this lucrative territory for years, they see weakness and they move in fast.
A turf war.
A massive one. The local factions start fighting block by block for control. The violence doesn't stop. It becomes the new normal.
And if that happens, the entire economy of PV is just gone.
Decades of economic instability. You simply cannot market a war zone as a relaxing family getaway.
So based on the sources, which scenario are we actually looking at right now?
That's the problem. Nobody really knows yet. We are deep in the fog of war. But there was a very observant point made by one of the economic sources regarding the timing of all this. There's a critical window.
The Mother's Day window, right?
Roughly, yes.
Yeah.
The idea is that the tourism industry is incredibly fragile. If foreign families don't feel safe enough to return by the upcoming spring and summer holiday seasons, if those images of burning buses stick in the global consciousness, the economic damage becomes completely self-fulfilling.
Because the dollars stop flowing.
Exactly. Even if the actual shooting stops next week, if the tourists don't come back, the local businesses have to close. Poverty rises sharply, and that desperation just fuels more local crime. It's a vicious cycle.
It's so fragile. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about the mechanics of cartels and the macroeconomics of it all, but we really have to remember the human element here. The regular people who are trapped in this.
The reports from the ground were just so chaotic. You had desperate people trying to get to the airport to flee, but the main roads were totally blocked by burning semi-trucks.
Yeah.
You had airline apps showing flights as, quote-unquote, on time when the airport was effectively under military siege.
That disconnection is terrifying to me. Imagine you're sitting in your hotel room looking at your phone, and the app says Flight 402 on time, but you look out your window and literally see a wall of smoke.
Right.
You're relying entirely on Twitter or Reddit because the official embassy channels are just blasting, "Stay inside."
And that leads directly to the get-out mentality we saw in the data. Once that level of panic sets in, even if the violence miraculously stops today, the reputation damage is done. People were paying exorbitant amounts of money for literally any seat on any plane leaving the country yesterday.
I want to pivot to the bigger geopolitical picture here. Why did this happen right now? And who else is actually involved behind the scenes? Because the sources make it clear this wasn't just a solo Mexican military operation.
No, it absolutely wasn't. Both the White House and the State Department quickly confirmed that the U.S. provided actionable intelligence for the raid.
And we know the U.S. administration has been pressuring Mexico heavily over the last year regarding fentanyl.
Correct. The CJNG isn't just about moving cocaine anymore. They were officially designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. in February 2025. They are a primary driver of the fentanyl crisis that is hitting American cities. So there is immense, constant political pressure from Washington to take these top guys out.
It definitely feels like a calculated win for the U.S. administration. They get to go on TV and say, "We got the bad guy."
Politically, yes, it looks like a massive victory. But this brings us right back to that sovereignty paradox we touched on earlier in the deep dive. The U.S. wants the kingpin gone to stop the flow of drugs entering the U.S. The Mexican government wants to execute these raids to show they are fundamentally in control of their own country. But for the people actually living and working in Puerto Vallarta,
Removing the kingpin actually made them way less safe.
in the short term, absolutely. The geopolitical analysis noted a really uncomfortable truth. The state is trying to assert legitimate control, but the cartel was the entity actually providing day-to-day safety in PV up until yesterday morning.
Wow.
By removing the source of the quote-unquote bad stability, the governments have introduced what they see as good chaos.
Good chaos. That is a really heavy phrase. It implies that this violent chaos is somehow a necessary stepping stone to eventually establish the real rule of law.
Theoretically, yes, that's the argument. It's the painful chaos of transitioning from criminal rule back to law enforcement rule.
Yeah.
But for the taxi driver who can't work today or the local hotel owner watching hundreds of cancellations roll in on their computer, it doesn't feel like justice at all. It feels like a total disaster. They are the collateral damage of this political win.
There was a user on one of the forums, I think their handle was Awk Technology, who put it really well regarding the U.S. perspective. They speculated about the underlying political motivations. They said, the U.S. admin looking for excuses to accomplish their various foreign policy goals is also a trump card in all this.
It adds a massive layer of unpredictability. If Americans get hurt in this fallout, or if the situation spirals down into that scenario maximus we talked about, does the U.S. get even more involved? Do we start seeing calls for more direct intervention?
And that is the huge unknown variable. If PV essentially becomes a war zone with thousands of American tourists physically trapped in their resorts, the pressure for intervention changes completely overnight. It stops being a joint law enforcement issue and becomes a domestic national security crisis for the U.S.
Which significantly complicates things for the Mexican government. They have to clean this up fast, not just to protect their own citizens and their economy, but to keep their very powerful neighbor to the north from stepping in even further.
It's a mess. It really is a deeply complicated mess. So where does this leave us as we wrap up today? We have a dead kingpin, a major resort city in lockdown, and a whole lot of people holding their breath.
We're basically in the waiting period. The next 48 to 72 hours are absolute critical. If the military can clear those blockades quickly, and perhaps more importantly, if the cartel leadership can consolidate power quietly without launching a civil war, PV might just survive this with a black eye.
That's scenario minimus. We go back to that uneasy Pax Mafiosa.
Exactly. But if the fighting continues into tomorrow, if we start seeing targeted attacks in the tourist zones continuing into the week, then we're likely watching the beginning of the end for Puerto Vallarta as a premier global destination.
It's stark. We celebrate when a kingpin is taken down. It fits our neat narrative of good guys versus bad guys perfectly. We see the mugshot on the news, we read the bold headline, and we think, great, case closed.
But in the complex ecosystem of organized crime, the kingpin is also the regulator. He's the dam holding back the flood. You blow up the dam, you might get the guy, but you drown the entire village in the process.
And that is exactly the thought we want to leave you with today. If El Mencho was the only thing actually holding back total chaos in Jalisco, is the victory of taking him down worth the immediate cost to the people living and vacationing on the ground? Are we watching justice finally being served, or are we just watching the start of a power vacuum that destroys a city?
It really forces us to rethink what winning the drug war actually looks like in practice. Because sometimes winning the battle means you lose the war.
Stay safe out there, everyone. And if you are listening to this from anywhere in Jalisco right now, our thoughts are with you. Stay informed, stay inside, and let's all hope for scenario minimus. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Take care, everyone.